Hi guys, so I'm going to introduce the nervous system now. We'll talk about important anatomy and physiology that we'll be covering. So let's start with the nervous system is divided up into two different sections. So the first section is the central nervous system, or the CNS. And if you think central, right, in the center of our bodies, which is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. So those act as the body's control center, coordinates body activities. It's the processing center where we're making decisions. And even the spinal cord kind of makes decisions because it's involved in reflexes. So there's some nerve responses that don't make it all the way to the brain. They just kind of circle around back in the spinal cord. Otherwise, the spinal cord is where all the messages get to and from the brain. And we've got the peripheral nervous system, which is all the nerves that extend from the brain and the spinal cord. So all these shown in yellow in this diagram are on the periphery of the nervous system. So it's made up of all the nerves that carry messages to and from the nervous system, the central nervous system, right? The brain and the spinal cord, and pretty much everything branches off of the spinal cord. So there's three main functions of the nervous system, and essentially three main types of neurons. The first would be sensory. So those are the ones that are collecting information from our environment, like in our senses. So in our skin, in our eyes, our nose, our mouth, our ears, we're collecting information. Integration are the ones involved in the processing. So those are the nerves that are in the brain and the spinal cord, where we're evaluating, comparing information, making decisions. And then motor neurons, or motor nerve responses, are the part of the body that responds to the stimulus. Sorry, you can't see that because my face is in there. Responds to the stimulus. So if our brain sends a response to our muscles, for example, there's motor neurons that are stimulating those muscles, or glands, for example. It's like the outcome of the nerve response. So sensory, we're taking information in, integration, we're processing it, and motor is the response. So a neuron is the basic unit of the nervous system, essentially a nerve cell. We've got the structure of the neuron here at the bottom of the diagram, or the bottom of the slide. You might want to draw a picture of that for your notes if that's not something that you already have committed to memory. It's made up of a couple different parts, which I'll go over quickly. The dendrites, so this is like the cell body here, this big purple part here. We've got the nucleus, which is the green, and the dendrites, which are like little sensory guys that are sticking their little hands out, and that's where signals come into the neuron. They come in through the dendrites. The axon is this long part here, and it's essentially the purple part that's underneath. The myelin sheath are these yellow, fatty, they're actually cells themselves that cover the axon. So the axon is like a long, like a cable wire essentially, and the myelin sheath goes around it. So underneath this yellow is still that purple cord of the axon. That's where the electrical signal, the action potential, travels down the neuron. The orange, or yellow, that myelin sheath, is just kind of acts as an insulation to help that electricity go faster. And then the ends are the axon terminals. That's where the chemical message gets released, the neurotransmitters. And that's where it would attach to the dendrites of another neuron. So those little chemicals would exit the axon terminal and go into the dendrites of the next connecting neuron. So many neurons together form a long nerve, and that's how those signals get from one place to another. So here's a microscopic image of an actual neuron. So you can see the cell body, or the soma, right here in the dark yellow. All these branches coming out from the top of that, those are the dendrites. This long part here is the axon, and then the axon terminal is the end here. So this is where the nerve would connect with another neuron. And like I said before, three types of neurons, just like there's three types of nerve functions, there's a type of neuron to go with each of those. We've got our sensory neurons, which are sensing the stimulus from the environment and transmitting that information to the brain or the spinal cord. Right? So we've got our sensory neuron here. Those connect to the interneurons, which are in the brain and spinal cord. Those are the decision-making cells. They form some kind of response. When they have that response, they send that message to the motor neurons, which either stimulate a muscle or a gland to complete the action that was desired. All right, so now let's talk about the actual nerve impulse. So the nerve impulse is a mixture of electrical and chemical signals. This is what you're going to be making a model of next week. It's a self-promoting wave of electricity that travels along the surface of the neuron membrane, sometimes called an action potential. So you can see here that signal that's created. It's an electrical signal that travels down the length of the axon. So at rest, neuron's membrane is slightly positive on the outside. It's called polarized because of a slight excess of sodium on the outside. Sodium ions have a positive charge. When it's triggered by a stimulus, so when the dendrites are getting some kind of information from the outside world, it triggers the opening of those channels and the plasma membrane of the neuron, and essentially active transport pumps those sodiums inside the cell so that there's a greater concentration of those positive charges on the inside of that cell. So essentially, let me move my face again. If you kind of look here, when the sodium ions rush in, and it's just a quick rush in and then it rushes back out again, that change in electrical charges is what's creating the electrical impulse. So that impulse continues all the way down the axon until it gets to the terminal. I'll include some videos, some links to videos of this on Google Classroom. So the synapse, so once that electricity gets to the axon terminal, the end of that terminal, the space between where the two neurons connect is called the synapse. So you can kind of see this here in this image. And that's where impulses are transmitted from one neuron to the next. So here's the original neuron, the axon. That electricity is going to stimulate the release of neurotransmitters into the synapse, and then those neurotransmitters are binding to receptors on the dendrites of the next neuron, which is essentially getting the information. So it's an electrical chemical impulse, right? We've got electricity in the action potential. Here is the chemical portion, the neurotransmitters. That's why it's called an electrical chemical impulse. Those neurotransmitters are chemicals that are released from the axon terminal and bind to receptors on the next neuron. This causes the opening of ion channels and thereby stimulating electrical impulse conduction on the next neuron. So it opens those sodium channels so there's the same response as the previous. Right? So we've got action potential, we've got that opening of sodium channels, sodium rushing in, causing that polarization and then quickly leaving again. So the electricity is moving down. Once it gets to the terminal, it's releasing those neurotransmitters into the synapse. So that's the chemical portion. And once this nerve gets stimulated, same thing's going to happen here. Action potential goes down, release of neurotransmitters to the next neuron. So here's just another image of those neurotransmitters. Again, they're chemicals that are released from one neuron to another to cause electrical chemical impulse. Here's a couple examples of neurotransmitters. You've probably heard of some of these. Acetylcholine, norepinephrine, dopamine, serotonin, endorphins, all really important for our daily lives. So what you'll be doing for your assignment next week is creating a model that shows that electrical chemical impulse. So you're going to have, and this is what I would have done if we were in class, but you're going to draw some kind of neurons, maybe draw them with markers or pens or whatever you have around the house, on a paper. Make sure they're labeled so I know that you understand the different parts of the neuron. And then I want you to show how the electrical impulse travels. So I want you to show the sodiums entering the cell, the potassiums leaving the cell, maybe some kind of electrical symbol like a little lightning bolt or something to show that it's traveling down the axon. And then once it gets to the end, the axon terminal, you're going to show the neurotransmitters being released to the synapse and to the next neuron. So at some point in your video, and you can do a stop motion video, like a series of several pictures. There's an app called Stop Motion Studio if you want to use that, or you can use iMovie or whatever you like. You're probably better at technology than I am. And at some point, all of these vocabulary words should be included somewhere in the presentation to show me that you understand how that nerve impulse moves. All right, so good luck. Email me if you have any questions, and I hope to see you soon.